So the last time we left off, we are talking about comparative advantage, and hopefully you understand what comparative advantage is right now. We said a country has a comparative advantage in a good in which has a low opportunity cost of actually producing. And we said according to the theory of comparative advantage, countries or people should specialize in whatever good you basically have a comparative advantage in. So, for example, the United States has a comparative advantage in producing cars. The United States should specialize in producing cars and basically trade cars or export cars. And we also found that specialization basically tends to make everyone better off. The next thing we'll look at is in terms of production and consumption possibilities and benefits of trade. So we'll look at things at the macro level. The first thing we need to discuss or probably explain is what we call a closed economy. So when we say closed economy and the sort of economic term used is autarky, being in autarky, a closed economy is basically any country that does not trade with the rest of the world. So a good example, we don't really have many countries in the world right now where there is a closed economy or where they are in autarky. But a good example is North Korea. Okay, so think of North Korea as being a country that has this closed economic system. So basically, a closed economy, the country is basically self sufficient or self dependent, and it doesn't trade with any other country in the rest of the world. And we have an open economy, and an open economy is basically the opposite of a closed economy. An open economy is generally any economy that allows exchange of goods and services. So basically, any economy that trades with the rest of the world or trades with other countries. Okay. So we'll look at a situation where we have production possibilities curve under a country that is basically in autarky or is basically has a closed economic system. Okay. So let's look at an example of the United States. So in the United States economy, just trying to make things as simple as possible, we have only two goods. Okay, so this country produces only two goods. It produces computers and it produces corn. Okay, so corn for food and computers for basically working. So that's the capital good. And we assume that this country basically has two workers. And they're able to work 50 weeks for the whole year. Okay, so our fixed resource in this example is essentially 50 weeks. Okay, our first worker is named Dallas, and Dallas can produce 100 bushels of corn, or he can produce one computer per week. Okay, so that's his productivity level. Okay, and we have the second worker who is Lindsay, and Lindsay can produce 100 bushels of corn or two computers per week. Okay, so this is the productivity information we have for the two workers in our simplified economy of the United States, where again we have two goods, we have computers and corn, and we have two workers who have fixed resources in the sense that they can actually work for only 50 weeks in the entire year. Our workers are named Dallas and Lindsay. Dallas can produce 100 bushels of corn or one computer per week, and Lindsay can produce 100 bushels of corn or two computers per week. So the first thing we need to do is construct our production possibilities curve. And the first step we do or we take is basically look at how much corn the United States can produce if Dallas and Lindsay worked full-time producing only corn. So suppose they actually generate all their resources towards the production of corn. How much corn would the United States actually produce? Okay, so we're basically doing what we've already done before, but we're doing it at a country level. Okay, so we know that Dallas in a week can produce 100 bushels of corn, and Lindsay in a week can produce 100 bushels of corn. We know that they're supposed to work for 50 weeks. Okay, that's the fixed resources, and we assume that they actually utilize all 50 weeks. They're not lazy and they're not slackers. Okay, so they actually utilize all the 50 weeks. Okay, so in that sense, right, if Lindsay produces 100 bushels of corn in a week, right, so that's going to be 100, okay, times 50. Okay, so every week she produces 100 bushels of corn, so in 50 weeks she's going to produce 5,000. If Dallas produces 100 bushels of corn in a week, so that's going to be 100 times 50. So that is going to equal 5,000 as well. Right? Then the total number of corn that can be produced in the United States, if every single resource is just put towards corn, is going to be 10,000 bushels of corn. Okay? So hence we have 10,000 bushels of corn here. Okay? The next step we need to take right, is look at the opposite. Suppose they decide to use all their resources. Again, we're trying to say that these, or we hold the assumption that these workers can't really multitask. It's either they produce corn or they produce computers. Okay, suppose they decide to use all their resources in production of computers. So the next thing we're looking at is basically computers. Okay, right, how much computers will the United States produce in that sense? So Dallas in a week can produce a computer, and Lindsay in a week can produce 2 computers. Okay, so if they both work 50 weeks in a year, then they'll have 3, right, computers produced every week. Okay, times 50, which is basically 50 weeks, and they'll have 150 computers. Okay, so if they decide to use all their resources to produce computers, they'll actually produce 150 computers. Okay, so that's the second part. Okay, the third part is basically knowing the fact that the United States can't produce only corn and produce only computers. Obviously, right, they need to produce a mixture of the two, right? You can't produce only corn and just have food and no Wi-Fi. Well, life would be really boring. And you can't produce only computers and not produce corn, because then you basically die because you can't really eat your computers, right? So the third thing is for them to produce a combination of corn or computers, but we actually use the concept of comparative advantage in actually to try and find the third step, okay, in actually constructing our production possibilities curve. Okay, who has a comparative advantage in producing what? Who should specialize in producing what, right? So like I said, the United States can't produce only corn, nor can it produce only computers, so we need to find a comparative advantage in production of each good. And hopefully by now you remember how to find a comparative advantage of a good. Right, so now let's look at Dallas' opportunity cost of producing computers. Okay, so to find out who has a comparative advantage in producing a good, we need to find out the person who actually can produce the good with the least opportunity cost. Okay, so let's look at Dallas's opportunity cost of producing computers. Okay, again, the formula is given by loss divided by gain. Right, so when we see the opportunity cost of producing computers, essentially, how many bushels of corn should Dallas give up in order to produce 1 computer? Okay, so that's going to be loss divided by gain, just like we did earlier on. And it's going to be loss in corn divided by gain in computers. Okay, so we have 100 bushels of corn divided by 1 computer. Or basically, we just look at the numbers, forget about the units. So 100 divided by 1. And in that sense, it's going to be 100 bushels of corn. Okay, so Dallas's opportunity cost of producing computers is essentially 100 bushels of corn. So in order to produce 1 computer, Dallas has to give up production of 100 bushels of corn. What about Lindsay? Okay, so Lindsay's opportunity cost of producing computers, again, we use the same formula, which is loss divided by gain. Okay, so this is going to be loss in corn divided by gain in computers. Right, so we have 100 bushels of corn divided by 2 computers, and it's basically 50 bushels of corn. Okay, so for Lindsay to actually produce 1 computer, she needs to give out 50 bushels of corn. For Dallas to produce 1 computer, he needs to give up 100 bushels of corn. So in that sense, Lindsay has the comparative advantage in producing computers because she actually gives up less corn in production of 1 computer. So in that sense, Lindsay should specialize in the production of computers. Okay, so Lindsay will use all her resources, all her 50 weeks to produce computers. So that's going to be 100 computers produced. Okay, and in that sense, we know that Dallas, if you actually calculate it, Dallas should actually produce corn. So Dallas has a comparative advantage in the production of corn. So he should use all his resources in the production of corn. So he's going to produce 5,000 bushels of corn, right? So that's 100 times 50. Okay, he produces 100 bushels per week. He has 50 weeks to work with. So it's 100 times 50, and we have 5,000. Okay, so in a way, our production possibilities curve is going to look like point A, where each basically produces, where all of them produce corn. We have point B, where all of them decide to produce computers. Okay, and we have sort of the optimal point, which is point C, where the split between the production of corn and the split between the production of computers. Okay, right. So if they specialize, they land at point C. Okay, so point C is basically specializing. Right. Well, what we can sort of deduce from this is that we can actually add a third worker. And if we have a third worker, suppose we actually add a third worker, maybe named Jack. If we add a third worker, we actually have many kinks where if each worker specializes, right, in the production of computers and corn, right, you do have many kinks in the production possibilities curve, right? So eventually in the real world, we actually have sort of a curved production possibilities curve, or line, because this curve, right, basically has each worker or each individual worker in the economy, right, who is specializing in some sort of who is basically specializing in the production of corn or computers. Okay. So in a nutshell, the opportunity cost, right, we can observe of producing an additional unit is basically the slope of the line that touches the point. Okay. So every single point on the curve, right, will have a line touching it, and that is basically opportunity cost. Okay. And one thing we can also say is that opportunity cost will increase as output of the good increases. Okay. So opportunity cost tends to increase over time. Okay. The more you're trying to produce computers, the more corn, or the more bushels of corn you basically need to give up. Okay. Tying this back into our closed economy and open economy scenario, in the case of autarky, basically your production possibilities, what you produce, like I said earlier, is equal to basically what you end up consuming. Okay, so your production possibilities end up being your consumption possibilities. But in an open economy where you actually allow for trade, and we already saw trade is quite beneficial, right? Society's consumption possibilities, or basically what society tends to consume, tends to be greater than what society tends to produce. Okay, and we can actually take a look at an example, right? So we actually had our example here, okay, of United States producing corn and computers, right? And we said the optimal amount was basically at point C. Right? So what if we actually come up with a scenario where the United States is open to trade? So this is a scenario where the United States is basically without trade. What if we come up with a scenario where the United States opens up to trade, and suppose that in the world market, okay, so this is hypothetical, in the world market, 80 bushels of corn, right, is traded for one computer. Okay, we already know that in specialization, right, Lindsay should produce computers and Dallas should basically produce corn. Okay, so Lindsay can actually trade 100 computers she produces at point C for 8,000 bushels of corn. Okay, plus the 5,000 bushels of corn Dallas already produces and end up at point F. So that's going to be 8,000 plus 5,000. So you're probably wondering to yourself, how do we get 8,000, right? Remember, it's 80 bushels for corn. 80 bushels of corn for one computer. Okay, so if you actually produce 100 computers, right, you can get 8,000 bushels of corn, and basically that's what she's doing. Okay, so now if they decide to actually just focus on corn and she trades her computers for corn, right, they get 13,000 bushels of corn. Likewise, Dallas can trade 5,000 bushels of corn because he specializes in the production of corn. Okay, for 62.5 computers. How do we get 62.5? It's basically 5,000 divided by 80, because again, remember, it's 80 bushels of corn for one computer. Okay. And you have the 62.5 computers he actually has from trade added to the 100 computers Lindsay is already producing, and you get 162.5 computers. Okay, so this is a case where the country decides to just consume all the computers, right? And in that sense, you have your consumption possibilities. So now the country can consume at point F, it can basically consume at point C, and it can consume at point G as well. And if you sort of juxtapose this with what you actually had in terms of your production possibilities, it's clearly obvious that your consumption possibilities with trade is better than your production possibilities without trade. Okay, so in a way, the country tends to be better off. Okay, and if you actually decide to put this example towards a mini worker economy, which is more pragmatic, you always see that the consumption's possibilities, which is basically our red line, is more than our production possibilities. Okay, so trade basically makes everyone better off. Okay, so the underlying story behind this is that trade tends to make everyone better off. Okay, so that closes our chapter, or that closes our section on comparative advantage and production possibilities. Okay, again, if you don't understand something and you feel like I went too fast, please just rewind, just go back and try and learn from there. If you still don't understand anything, just shoot me an email and I'll be more than happy to assist you. Okay. The next section we'll actually look at is supply and demand perspective on trade, which is pretty more simple because we're all used to supply and demand, right? So the first rule we need to know is that if the price of a good in a closed economy is greater than the world price, and if that economy decides to open up for trade, the economy will tend to be a net importer of that good. Okay, so suppose the country is a closed economy, okay, and the world price is lesser than the price in the closed economy. The economy or the country basically tends to be a net importer, meaning it actually buys from the world market. Okay, so we'll actually look at an example. So then we have price of computers. So let's look at the market for computers in the United States. So you have price of computers. We have quantity of computers. Okay. We have domestic supply. So we have our supply here, which is upward sloping. We have our domestic demand, which is downward sloping. And we have the closed economy equilibrium. Okay, so this is our equilibrium price. And essentially this is our equilibrium quantity. Okay. Right. Now, suppose that price, or the world market price, is basically less than the closed economic price. Okay, so the closed economic price is P, and you have the world market price at, let's say, WP, right? If this country actually opens up for trade, right, this country will become a net import or net importer of computers, because the world price of computers is relatively cheaper than the closed economy price. Okay, so more consumers, right, will move along the demand curve, as you can see over here, and more consumers will actually decide to import computers. Okay, at the same time, domestic supply will actually decrease because you don't have a lot of producers willing to supply at that price. Okay, so with a difference, you actually have imports. Okay, so the imports will equal, so imports will basically equal quantity demanded minus quantity supplied. Okay, so at the world price, quantity supplied is smaller than the quantity demanded, hence people will buy from the world market, which actually makes sense. Okay, if the price of computers in the United States is cheaper, for example, than the price of computers from Japan, assuming the same quality and holding all other things equal, the rational economic agents will buy computers from Japan, and that's what's going to happen. Okay, so you're going to have this sort of artificial gap created over here, And this artificial gap basically becomes your input. Okay, so people will not buy at P, but they'll actually buy at the world price, and hence the country becomes a net importer. Okay, so a net importer, a country becomes a net importer always when the world price is less than the closed economy price. Okay, so when the world price, which is WP, is less than the closed economy price, which I'll call CP, okay, the country is a net importer, which actually makes sense. Things are cheaper outside. If you open up for trade, people will tend to buy from outside because things are cheaper there. Okay. The second rule using supply and demand on trade is that if a price of a good in a closed economy is lower than the world price and that economy opens up for trade, the economy will tend to be a net exporter of that good.